Thank you very much, Comrade, for inviting me for this podcast to discuss not just in essence, but the significance of African Liberation Day and the concept of Pan-Africanism. We are just a few days away from the African Liberation Day celebrations. And from our perspective, which I mean the Communist Party of Kenya perspective, to understand the concept of Pan-Africanism and the significance of African Liberation Day celebration, it also entails the correct analysis of the current, not just countries in Africa, which are basically small nations that were created outside the African continent, but also to understand the conditions of the black population that were taken out of Africa against their will. Now, in our analysis, is that the historical background of African liberation, as espoused by our forebearers under African Freedom Day, 1963, OAU, which is the Organization of African Countries, and now African Union. Its core principle was a liberated, free, independent African country. Indeed, a sovereign African country, African nation, together with the African people that found themselves without the continent against their will. In fact, Pan-Africanism as a concept started from outside the African continent. Now, the question that we must ask ourselves today: did we achieve the total independence of Africa and the African people? And if we did, to what extent? In the perspective of the Communist Party of Kenya, which is also a Pan-African organization, we hold the correct analysis that all the African countries as they exist today still serve their colonial masters under a neocolonial system. And we have seen that the liberation movements that received a lot of support from the Liberation Committee under the concept of African Liberation Day and its founding forebearers like Kwame Nkrumah have degenerated into a neocolonial project. So it basically means that Kenya included, our priority as a vanguard party of the working class is to unite all the progressive forces as a way to embrace the African Liberation Day, to defeat the neocolonial project and its sponsors outside the country and the servants that have been hired by our former colonizers. So the correct analysis is indeed the best gift we can do in memory of our forebearers. That to clearly say that African Liberation Day holds its significance today because the African independence remains incomplete and either was hijacked by a neocolonial project, including Kenya. Our task today must be to utilize the African Liberation Day to mobilize all progressive forces to complete our independence. In this way, then we will give meaning to the principles that our forebearers actually espoused at the beginning of the African Liberation Day. That we must further defeat the enemies, which at that time was the Settler-Colonialism. And at this time, we have seen many movements in Africa, so-called liberation movements, that have degenerated into only neocon projects. So this African Liberation Day 2024 must be then an awakening moment for all the revolutionaries and progressives within the African continent to articulate the correct position that the enemies of the African people are not just the dominant class in the global north, but they are puppets that continues to manipulate and serve the foreign interest against the development of the African continent and the African people. And to expose the incorrect analysis, mainly within the academic circles, that do not appreciate that the underdevelopment within the global south is indeed a shared responsibility between our former colonizers and failure of leadership at home. Moving in its correct objective is that what could this freedom that Kwame Nkrumah and his comrades actually explained and brought out clearly? It was not just about the replacement of a white man. It was just not a hollow talk about, for example, the ruling elite changing their colors from being white to black and still holding positions of privileges and advancing their repression, oppression, land theft within the African continent, and even impeding the people who try to access the continent, especially those that found themselves in the global north against their will, to have not a way out to come and resettle back in the African continent. So we will say that that freedom also meant that without economic independence, without food, and a good example is most of the freedom movements in Africa were anchored on one solid pillar, which was landlessness or a squatter problem. That was really an artificial problem caused by the colonial governments that occupied the African continent. This year's 2024 African Liberation Day reminds us that without economic independence, we cannot talk about sovereignty. Without achieving food sovereignty, we cannot talk about our independence. When we actually give up the project to feed our people, we give it to big multinationals and profiteers agencies and criminal outfits like Bill Gates Foundation, and we do not look internally in a way that we can actually feed our own population, then we are still under the substitute of the foreign forces that continue to make sure that the African as a continent do not come out from the shackles of colonialism or neocolonialism. Issue of food sovereignty has been reduced within the bourgeois academic circles on addressing it only within the purview of technology. So, for them to answer food sovereignty, we need to enhance biological processes and mutilate genetics, what they're calling genetic engineering, and embrace chemical farming, and even things like genetically modified, food commodities. But even though we recognize the power of science in addressing this food sovereignty, we must continue to expose that the overemphasis of biotechnology or GMOs is to turn away the interest of the people from the main problem, which is land for profits. Because if we have, for example, 99% of the Kenyan population, or most of the lands in most of the population in Africa, only occupies a piecemeal of just about 5% of the total coverage of their land. And the majority of that land, for example, in Kenya, are in the hands of either big landlords, church institutions, politicians, and this land is not collectively being used to produce, things that could help us to maintain life in the continent. But this land is used only for speculative purposes and used to plant cash crops, mainly for export, leaving Africans in pure starvation and just vulnerable to death in terms of food sovereignty. So we think, from the Communist Party perspective, that land, food, as one of the core tenets of this African Liberation Day, resonates with the total freedom and sovereignty that was fought for by our forebears. We also want to say that the concept of Pan-Africanism cannot be looked at from within the neoliberal globalization arrangement. Because those who are talking about unity of the African people and the African continent under neoliberal globalization, being under the dictates of the dominance class of the West, must realize that we do not desire such a unity. Because that is a unity like the unity of Europe, that which is built on plunder, enslavement like that of the United States of America, and development at, the expense of the rest of the continent. We do not have any desire to enslave any race. We do not have any desire to even colonize any race to develop our country. But we must say that a united, free and liberated African people within and without Africa is only possible once we defeat our primary enemy, which is the United States imperialism. Only when we do that and accelerate our national projects, which is the national democratic revolutions in various countries, and establish a vanguard party at the national level and at the continental level to continue to reinforce the progressive and the revolutionary forces and install a wide scale and a continental scale what we are calling the National Revolutionary Project, and start an immediate process of building our continent under the correct ideology, which is the scientific socialism, then we can still say that the true liberation of the African kind is still very far, because it cannot be achieved without the liberation of the rest of the parts of the globe, which we must always say that Pan-Africanism is just an objective reality. But the software that runs Pan-Africanism, say be it, is only scientific socialism. So we must continue to insist that the revolutionary political parties and workers' political parties and organizations within the African continent must take up the immediate task to attract, organize, and mobilize all the revolutionary forces within the continent in a coordinated and a scientific manner to defeat our class enemy. Only until then that we can say that we can contribute to the global vanguard of the proletariat and advance steadfastly and zealously in terms of achieving our revolutionary duty, which is to liberate the African continent and the rest of the global south, liberated from the shackles of colonialism. In that way, we see that those who want to pervert the concept of Pan-Africanism with the African Day concept or African Rising, where they intend to open only Africa for markets and for deeper exploitation by the dominance class and multinational and transnationals from mainly the global north. Those are people that are the enemies of the African continent. So today, we want to remind ourselves that the total liberation of the African people is only possible under under a Pan-African movement anchored on a clear ideology, which is a scientific socialism and mobilization of all forces at the point of strengthening the vanguard within our national territories and uniting those vanguards and the national territories to form the continental vanguard, and then contributing to the biggest project, which is the vanguard of the international, the vanguard of the global proletariat. In that case, we will have answered the correct duty that we inherited from our forebearers, which were indeed socialists, like Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, like Abdurrahman Mohamed Babu, like Kwame Nkrumah, like the black consciousness figures like Steve Biko, or the hero of the African continent, Mandela, or Thomas Sankara, or Amilcar Cabral. All these people have been celebrated within the bourgeois space, but have been stripped of their revolutionary character. I think in 2024 African Liberation Day, we need to redeem their character and build their revolutionary content and showcase the world that these people that were mostly murdered by the CIA under the directorship of the United States dictatorship were indeed socialist. And the big project that they started under the African Liberation Day and the formation of African Union must be our responsibility to take it to its logical conclusion, which is a free, liberated Africa and a scientific socialism.